Since it's July 4th weekend, I thought it would be a good idea to have a video talking about the impacts of colonization on the places I've traveled to, especially where it was pretty prominent because this is the holiday that the United States sought for independence from Britain. Europe being the first continent I've ever traveled to outside of the US, I thought it was really interesting to be going to all the other continents later and seeing the impacts of their colonization. That wasn't something I intended to notice, but it was just interesting that you could tell who were their colonizers. So the first country I went to after my study abroad in France, which was the reason why I was able to see a lot of Europe, was Morocco. And specifically I went to Marrakesh, which is in the southern part of the country, and you could tell like almost straight off the bat that they were colonized by France because the language they speak a lot to the tourists is French, and they actually prefer speaking French over English. When I was talking to a salesperson on my last day in Marrakesh, he was so nice, so nice. And he actually asked me if I could speak French because he preferred it. And I was like, yeah, like a peu, petit peu, like very little because of my semester in France. And then also, sometimes they just talk to you in French. So that's why in my video, I really suggested that you come knowing at least numbers in French. I want to leave some big ones that I noticed a lot of similarities to their colonizer near the end of the video because I have a lot to say about them because I was there longer slightly. These next few ones are just going to be really quick things that I noticed immediately about the impacts their colonizer had on them because I can't distinctively remember every detail right now because it's been a little bit since I've been locked in my house. But once I get all my vlog footage in, or I get more vlog footage in, hopefully I should have a lot more by July 4th the next year if coronavirus gets tamed and people can travel again. I'll have a lot more info on how these colonies were impacted. So the Philippines at one point was colonized by so many different groups. Spain controlled them at one point, and you could see that in the Filipino language because at least the one in Cebu, because it has a lot of traces from Spanish. It's not completely Spanish, but you could tell that it was mixed in with whatever their indigenous language was. And in Cebu, which is the Filipino island I went to, they speak English really well, and that is probably because the US actually colonized them at one point. Another place France colonized is Vietnam, which is actually my motherland. If you guys didn't know, I'm Vietnamese. When I was in France, so I was there for like a decent amount of time because I was studying abroad for a whole semester. So me and my roommate Stephanie, we were getting school supplies and she was getting journals, and we were trying to find them, and then we finally found some journals. When we opened it, we both were like, we just stared at it for a bit because it had the basics of line paper, so like the one red line and then a bunch of blue lines. It had that, but then it also had a bunch of lines in between and then vertical. So it really looked like graph paper, and we were like, oh, that's gonna be hard to get used to. So that was kind of weird because that just like really stood out that that's the normal paper they write on. It's just graph paper, even though you can write words on it. And then when the first day I was in Vietnam, my nephew was doing his schoolwork and I saw that and I was like, why is your paper like that? I literally asked them just to see like what they would think, and they really like went into detail about how it just helps them keep the sizes correct, or like like with their letters because it has to fit in one of the little graph boxes and just helps them stay organized. But really in my head I was like, no man, that's French colonization. That which is so crazy to me. That was the first time I really realized that I could see the impacts of my first travels. So like the first time I traveled, which is throughout Europe, on the other places I've traveled, because I saw that tiny, like, strange little cultural trait even though it was just on paper, but I was like, what? Because they both stood out to me both times, and I was definitely like, huh, that's a thing. And I actually posted that on my Instagram story, and I was so scared to post it because I was like, I don't know if people are gonna understand. I don't know if that's just weird. And people really liked it. Another impact that the French had on the Vietnamese culture is the language. So if you looked at the Vietnamese language, it looks a lot like English with a bunch of accents, which is kind of what French looks like. But if you go around to the surrounding countries of Vietnam, their languages don't use the same characters as English, Vietnamese, and French, which is so weird because you could tell like, oh, it's because the French colonized this area. The last thing on France, because I saw it firsthand, but colonization, it created this system of racism all around the world, which is why it's such a bad thing, or one of the reasons why it's such a bad thing. But that's along with all the culture that was lost and on the French, basically, because they created this system that is racism. You could tell a lot in their country that basically the Black people aren't treated as equally as the white people. So in my French school, we first saw this like in our cafeteria, because the cafeteria servers were all Black, and then our professors were white. Black people in France really don't have the best jobs, and you could tell that's because of how oppressed they are there. And there was this one time me and Stephanie were hanging around the Eiffel Tower, and all of a sudden, all the people that were selling keychains around the Eiffel Tower, if you've ever been to Paris, you know who they are. They just be walking around with these little keychains on rings, and then sometimes they have bigger things like magnets and etc. But all of a sudden, they all just ran like past us away from the Eiffel Tower, and then later, like somewhat close behind, police were running towards them, and then they got one. Like really, they only caught one person because everyone else like was running faster. And then we saw him being mistreated. They like kicked him, and okay, they kicked him. Yeah. Ugh. So yeah, you could tell, because like just like here in America that I've talked about in my videos, there is a system. Recently with the Black Lives Matter movement, a lot of people have been protesting there about it, which is awesome because it's needed there too. And it's so weird to think, because like once I heard that they had pretty major protests, I was like, yeah, they definitely need it, because I saw police brutality there firsthand as a tourist, basically. I mean, I was a student there too, but I was basically a tourist student, a long-term tourist. Next, we're gonna go to British colonies, because they took over almost a whole quarter of the world at one point, so you can really see the impact. And they were also our colonizers. Can you hear my stomach? I'm kind of hungry. Oops. So yeah, British was the US's colonizer at one point, so you can definitely see their impact here. Most recently with the cause of racism. Most recently with racism again, but just the language we speak and just our mindset of democracy, which translates a lot to Hong Kong right now with all their protests. And they're not doing so well. They are not. So sad. But Hong Kongers have a very democratic mindset. which is so far against what China wants their citizens to think. They are just, so you've probably heard of censored news that goes on in China, and the fact that they don't have access to other things like Google and Facebook because they don't want their citizens to think otherwise. And Hong Kongers are not down for that because they were colonized by Britain, and they have this very free mindset that helps them fight for their rights and their beliefs, which is so important, I think, in any society so that we can progress. And that's the whole reason why they are trying to change their country, but in recent years they haven't been doing well, or some laws have been passed that aren't allowing them to do that, which is so stupid. But that's another impact of colonization, because they're also being impacted by China. So China is really trying to enforce things on them. But we'll see. Another impact that they had on Hong Kong was the language they speak. So they speak both Cantonese, Chinese, and English. It's a bilingual country, so a lot of official documents have to be both in Cantonese, I believe, and English, like, next to each other, which is pretty cool. And I wanted to talk about my time in Hong Kong because I was there for a long time. That was where I did my second study abroad semester exchange. So the biggest part is that they have super democratic beliefs, which is why they are protesting so much and really trying to fight for their rights, because they really should be having these rights. And the fact that China wants to take over in certain areas is really limiting to them. That's all they want. They just want more rights than what they're getting from Chinese rule. And another impact, you could really tell that in Hong Kong, because I spent so much time there, that they were colonized by the French. So daily, or when you would hear the students speaking English, they spoke in a very clear accent almost. It was very close to a British accent. And even one time when I was at this event where the students were forced to speak English because it was to help train them to use it and practice the language, I was sitting with a British girl and another student was speaking English, but he was definitely a local. She was like, oh, he has a British accent. So if you've ever been to London, which is probably the most visited area of the UK, every time you leave the tube, which is their train system, they're always like, please mind the gap, which is so funny. So basically there is a gap from the train to the platform that you walk on to go to the rest of the area, and like, you could lose a lot of things there if you miss it. Sometimes the gap is pretty big. And there's also one like that in Hong Kong, and they literally say, please mind the gap. Which is so interesting because that's kind of an inside joke with people who visited London. Like, there are tourist shirts that are like, please mind the gap. And then the fact that I went to Hong Kong and I saw that. Okay, now on to Singapore, which is where I went straight after Hong Kong because the protests actually got really severe. If you want me to talk a little bit more about leaving Hong Kong during that time, because it was pretty crazy, I can talk about it in another video. In Singapore, their official language is English, which is so surprising because everywhere around it in Asia, that's not a thing. But Singapore is really good about keeping their people bilingual, and it's a very diverse country too, which is awesome. I can't believe I didn't mention this, but a lot of the places where Britain ruled, they drive on the left side of the road. So Singapore and Hong Kong and Australia, they all drive on the left side of the road, which is so confusing. And then lastly, Australia, which is where I also spent another 2 weeks, which was the last place I actually went to because all my other plans to go to other places were canceled by coronavirus. So yeah, Australia. And I have a lot of Australian friends, so I know a lot about their history too. And I was kind of scared to mention this, but my friend Anna, hi Anna, if you're watching this, she's also been in my past Australian videos, so if you want to check that out. We had talked about basically their biggest impact is on Indigenous Australians. Let me see what she said, because she replied to my story on Instagram. If you haven't followed me, definitely follow me because my stories help make my next videos. So I asked if anyone had a specific country they wanted me to talk about, and oh, someone said Mexico and Spain. Why did I just see this? Okay, but I've never been to Mexico, so I can't really talk about Mexico. Indigenous Australians are impacted by the long-lasting effects of colonization every day. So yes, that is definitely true. And although I can't get into the details, they definitely have a loss of identity. Something I wanted to say about them is that you could tell that their indigenous culture was there. A lot of indigenous places are big tourist attractions now, so like a big thing, I don't know if you would know. Hi Daddy. Okay. So if you know what Uluru is in Australia, it's basically like a big rock or a big mountain, and that is an indigenous location. A lot of these tourist attractions have been, you know, exploited for tourism and economic benefit when they were originally indigenous areas, which is so sad. And it's very similar to Native Americans, especially right now. The Navajo Nation, which is a very big area of Native Americans, they are not getting the benefits of the rest of the US. They have such a high concentration of COVID-19 there. So if you don't know what's going on there, please look into it, because that is a huge impact that colonization has, and a big example of colonization, because they just are not helping the people whose land they took and basically mass murdered. I gotta go to work soon. Another example of colonization I saw in Australia is obviously their language is English, but they have a lot of indigenous influence in their language. So I saw this, okay, well, I saw it before because Australia has interesting names and maybe pronunciations. I'm not sure if that's directly related to colonization, but they pronounce things interestingly. And I saw this most like in your face prominent when I went to Malulabu. Let me look that up. No, Malulaba, which is a city on Sunshine Coast. And I just remember seeing this and I was like, huh, that's an interesting name. And I definitely looked it up, and it is rooted in the indigenous language. So it's cool that they still keep parts of that into their everyday life. If the names of places in Australia aren't straight up just common English and they're not drawn from indigenous languages, then a lot of the time their names have come from Britain. So the most popular place to go to in Australia is Sydney, which is in the state of New South Wales, which Wales is, it's a part of Britain, and it's the New South Wales, which is kind of interesting because that's also how like we name parts of the US. A lot of the 13 colonies like New York, there are new places of UK. in Queensland, which is the Australian state I did a road trip through, that's obviously like, okay, maybe it's not obvious, but Queensland is because they have the Queen, they share the Queen of England, which I think is is what they do in the Commonwealth. They share a Queen. Ugh. So on June 8th, which is actually my birthday, my Australian friend was texting me, oh, happy birthday, and then we were talking, and it was apparently the Queen's birthday, which is just a holiday. It's not actually the Queen's birthday, but it's a holiday they celebrate. So they definitely have a lot of things rooted in the British culture. Somewhat like us in the US, colonization has changed the places of their colonies, and I think it's really good to be able to see how they impact it. So once I go through my vlog footage, I'll be able to tell you even more. But I think it just helps to see how globalization has changed cultures and what they've done to cultures, sometimes good, sometimes bad. I was able to just see like why a country is like this because I knew its colonizer. I don't know, I really don't know how to end it, but I gotta go to work. So subscribe for more. Definitely, if you want to learn more about the impacts of colonization, give this video a thumbs up so I can give it to you. Happy July 4th, I guess. If you're gonna celebrate it this year.